We are going to be covering AJAX today, and AJAX is basically used to reload portions of a page or load portions of a page without reloading the actual page itself. And when you update portions of a page, you can use HTML data, JSON, or XML data. That's primarily what's used. Today we're going to be focusing on how to do AJAX calls within a single domain. So you're basically going to be updating portions of a page with your own data. And then next week, we are going to be accessing developer sites on the web, and we're going to be going in and making API calls and then updating portions of a page based on the results we get back. So for this week, understanding how AJAX works and learning more about XML and JSON is basically going to prepare you for what we are going to be learning next week. And as I mentioned, AJAX is basically used to update a portion of a page without actually reloading it. And this little graphic kind of shows you how the process works. So there's some kind of an event that happens in the browser, and XML HTTP request object is created, and a request is sent to a server. The server processes the HTTP request, and it formats a response, and it sends the response back to the browser. And then basically the browser checks the response, and if the response looks good, it processes the data and it updates the page without actually reloading the page. So that's kind of in a nutshell how the process works. And AJAX does use a combination of XML HTTP request object, JavaScript DOM, CSS, and typically XML or JSON for data storage and page updates. Couple key points that you should remember about AJAX. You can use AJAX to load XML, JSON, or even HTML. And the file you are accessing has to be in the same domain, which means they have to be on the same web server. Now, there are a couple of workarounds for this. You can actually make a call to a developer site in a script tag and have a callback function process what the server returns. That's what we're going to be dealing with next week. Okay, so for this week, we are primarily focusing on same domain, which means it's going to be files that you create that you are going to be pulling in and updating your page with. Probably the most important thing to remember is that you cannot test AJAX files offline. They have to be live on the server. If you try to test them offline, you're going to get an error and they aren't going to work. Okay, and usually it takes 1 or 2 times before you remember, oh yeah, I've got to test these live. So giving you a fair warning up front, make sure you transfer your page and test it live, and you won't run into any problems testing. We are going to go through the different objects that you're going to be using in an AJAX call. And then we're going to take a look at a program that uses the objects that we're going to be talking about. So basically, we're going to kind of take a look at each piece, and then we're going to put it together into a program so you can see how all these different pieces fit in to an AJAX call. And as we mentioned earlier, XML HTTP request object is used to exchange data with a server kind of behind the scenes. to create the object, you basically have a variable, you set that equal to new XML HTTP request, and that variable becomes an object. Okay, and typically the name is XHTTP or something like that, so that you know it is an XML HTTP request object. Once you create the object, there are several methods that you can call using the object. And the first method, and we saw this used up here, is new XML HTTP request, and that's how you create the request object. You can also call the abort method, which, as the name implies, it cancels the current request. You can get a response header or all the response headers, and that returns header information. You can use it to call the open method, and we are going to be using that in our code. And the open method basically indicates if this is a get or a post request. Okay? And if you remember from HTML5 forms, typically a get request displays up on the address bar and a post request is hidden. URL is the resource that you want to use to update the page. And for what we're doing today, that resource is going to be one of your own files. Async, if you're using AJAX, that's typically true. You want asynchronous project or asynchronous processing. And that is because you don't want the web browser to sit around waiting for the server. You want it to do other tasks, and then when the server is ready with the response, you want the response to be processed. So you don't want your browser kind of sitting in a wait stage. You want it to keep running. Okay, so you want asynchronous set to true. You can pass it a username and a password, but you do not have to. Those are optional. Then we have send, and this is where you send the request to the server. You can also do send string, and the difference is send is used for get requests and send string is used for post requests. You can also use set request header, where you add a label value pair to the header that you are sending. And you will see several coding examples where we are using some of these. We tend to use open and send, probably the most, more so than the other ones. And let's see. The XML HTTP request objects has several properties. So what we were just looking at were methods. Now we're looking at properties. And you're going to be using some of these. So on ready state change is a function to be called when the ready state property changes. Now, what is the ready state property? As the server is processing the request, it sends back a ready state status for kind of each stage that it completes. So when it first receives the request, it sends back a 0 that says the request hasn't been initialized. Okay? Then after the server connection is established, it sends back a 1. After it actually has received the request, it sends back a 2. So as it goes through processing the request at each stage, it is sending back a ready state. When the ready state hits 4, then you can actually process what the server is sending you. Prior to that, you can't. Response text and response XML. If the server sends you back an XML file, then you'll be using response XML. If it's something else that the server is sending back, then you're probably going to use response text. Status is another thing that you're going to check. You could check status or status text. We're going to be checking status because this basically tells you if the server handled the request correctly, if there were no problems. It sends you back a 200, which means everything is okay. So now we are getting into actual coding. And to send a request to the server, you need to use open and send. And we kind of looked at these before, but you can see we've got our XML HTTP request object. We're calling the open method, and we're sending it a GET request followed by the URL of the file we are processing and true so that the processing is asynchronous. Okay, and then we're sending that off. Processing the data returned. So assuming that the server got the request, it went through all of its little stages, and it was successful, and it is returning data to the place that called it. Okay, this is the process that it goes through while it is processing the request and then determining what data to send. We use our XML HTTP object to call on ready state change. You can see this is an anonymous function. And so basically, when the ready state changes, and you know it changes because it starts at a 0 and it ends up at 4, each time that ready state changes, we are going to check where the ready state is at, and we're going to check where the status is at. So if the ready state is 4 and the status is 200, it is done processing and the processing was successful. Anything else, it is not done and it was not successful. Okay, so every time the ready state changes, it's going to come down and it's going to check to see if the ready state is 4, status is 200. Okay, so if we look up here, you can see the ready state starts at 0, goes to 1, 2, 3, 4. And for status, we have several different values that it could be. So it's only going to go through the code if everything was processed correctly. Okay, and then what this little line of code is doing is we're taking the current response text and we are updating the page at the poem display ID's location. We're actually updating the HTML there with whatever response text contains. And it is helpful to see this in a full-blown example. So this is the full code. And so I've got a couple buttons. I'm going to actually show you what this looks like. Pick a poem or a song, and if I click, now you can see that it loaded that up and it updated the page. And this is being done with AJAX. Okay, I didn't go up and reload the page. So the program that is running that, you'll notice that in our HTML, we've got a couple buttons with IDs. And then we have a little pick a poem or song heading. And you can see that if we have an event listener for Lewis, so if they click on that button, we create a XML HTTP request object, and then we check the ready state. Now, at this point, the first time through, okay, the ready state hasn't changed. Okay, so it just kind of skips down here, and then we've got our XHTTP object calling the open method. open that method is saying use get, send the jabberwocky.html file, and then asynchronous is set to true. Okay, so this is what we have to open up, and then this is the statement that sends it to the server. So how this gets processed is, first it creates the request object. It can't go through this section of code yet, so then it comes down here and it opens up the resource that we want to send, and then it sends off the resource to the server. Once the server has it, it checks the ready state. And remember, it starts at a 0, then it goes to a 1, then it goes to a 2. Okay, so it's checking the ready state to see if it's a 4, which means it's done processing. And if it's a 4, we want to check the status because we need it to be 200, which indicates it ran okay. So if that is the case, then we're going to take the response text. And the response text comes from jabberwocky.html. Okay? It is the resource that you sent to the server. Okay, so it's going to take response text, which is the resource, and it's going to display it in the page at the poem display location. Okay, and that was all for Lewis. And now if you look down on Marley, you're basically going to notice the exact same thing. So we have an event listener for Marley. If they click on that button, we create our XHTTP object. We are going to check the ready state, but at this point, it's not changing. Okay, so it's going to skip over that. We run the open method. We send it get, the name of the resource that we want to open, and true. Okay, so we kind of format that and then we send it. Once the request is sent, the server is going to start processing it and the ready state is going to change. So each time the ready state changes, it checks the number to see if it's equal to 4. And if it's equal to 4, we're going to check the status to see if it is equal to 200. And then once both of those are true, it's going to take the text that was in 3 little birds and it's going to display it at the location of ID poem display, which is right up here. And that's pretty much what the code is doing. And what we were just looking at is AJAX, JavaScript, and HTML. Whatever you can do in JavaScript, you can pretty much do in JQuery. So this little example is the exact same thing, but we're using JQuery instead of JavaScript. And you can see that we kind of put our JQuery code up at the top. And so we've got document.ready, so it's not going to run until everything is loaded. And then we are calling .ajax. We're giving it the URL of the resource. And then we're indicating what should happen when it is successful. So we indicate what the URL is. It's going to send that automatically to the server. And then if it is successful, we have this little anonymous function where we are going to display the result. And result is what is getting returned from the server. And you'll notice Marley does pretty much the same thing. We have an AJAX call. We are identifying our resources 3littlebirds.html. And once it is successful in accessing the resource and returning it to us, we're going to take that result and we are going to display it in the poem display section. So let me quick show you this one, because this is basically this, it looks the exact same. Okay, the difference is this is done in JQuery. The other one we looked at was JavaScript. Okay, so here's JavaScript, and this one is JQuery.